Editor of Auto Finance News. I'm pleased to welcome you to this webinar, Getting Ready for CFPB Examinations, presented by the Center for Auto Finance Excellence. The Center is an industry resource that shares best practices and actionable advice with auto finance professionals. Auto Finance News and Fiserv launched the Center in 2013 for the benefit of the auto finance community. The Center shares its content through events like this and at autofinanceexcellence.org, where you can sign up for our alerts. Thanks again for participating in this webinar today. This is one of a four-part series of webinars in 2015 presented by the Center for Auto Finance Excellence through the generous support of Fiserv. This pre-recorded webinar is scheduled to last about an hour. In the webinar, we will explore how to prepare to be examined by the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Starting around September 1st, the CFPB extends its jurisdiction for the first time to non-bank larger participants. CFPB examination is more familiar to bigger banks, but it's new for non-banks. Our speakers today are Jennifer Hampson, a regulatory exam specialist with VW Credit, Inc. She's a VW Credit veteran, having joined the captive finance company in 2001. Before her present assignment, she worked as an internal auditor and regulatory audit specialist. Also on the panel is Tricia Cacciola, a partner with Hudson Cook, a law firm that specializes in consumer finance law. Before joining Hudson Cook earlier this year, she was an assistant general counsel and executive director at J.P. Morgan Chase, providing legal guidance within Chase Auto Finance. Helping moderate the panel is Michael Benoit, also a partner with Hudson Cook. He advises banks, finance companies, auto dealers, leasing companies, mortgage lenders and other creditors, and technology providers on consumer financial services law. He also provides financial services trade associations with advice on federal legislation and regulations. Additionally, he writes a regular column for Auto Finance News. Today's webinar will be available on the Center for Auto Finance Excellence website at autofinanceexcellence.org. We encourage you to share a link to the webinar with your colleagues. With that, let's get started. Michael,
Thanks,
can you start with some background on why are we here?
Absolutely. Well, why we're here is pretty much as you stated. The Bureau recently finalized its larger participant rule for auto finance, which will, for the first time, give the Bureau supervisory authority, exam authority, if you will, over non-bank auto finance companies. Now, certainly the banks that are in the auto finance business are accustomed to CFPB exams and accustomed to federal exams generally through their banking regulators. But this will be something new for the non-depository finance companies, the first time that they'll have a federal regulator that has exam authority over them. As you've seen in the paper with different consent orders and settlements with the Bureau has exercised its enforcement authority over the auto finance industry, and it has had that authority from the first day that it was officially up and running. Now they'll have a different arrow in their quiver, if you will, to regulate non-bank auto finance companies, and that's through the exam process. And we have two great people here with us, Tricia Cacciola, my new partner and someone that I've known for many, many years, and Jennifer Hampson, who's a good friend and an expert at what she does. And I think between the three of us, we'll hopefully be able to give you a good sense of what to expect from a CFPB exam. And with that, I think where we should probably start is to talk a little bit about what companies should do to get ready for an exam before the CFPB ever shows up, before they ever send a letter, before you ever even know that an exam is being scheduled. So why don't we start with Trish? Maybe you can give your thoughts on that topic, and then we'll pass it to Jennifer.
Sure. I think first and foremost what the CFPB is looking for is what I like to call a survival kit for financial institutions. And so they're going to come in expecting to see policies, procedures, a governance process, an audit process with board compliance or legal oversight of the process. So I think the key thing before the CFPB announces that they're arriving on your doorstep is to take a look at your organization and the operation. And you should have policies and procedures in place, both to govern sort of the administration from a compliance perspective, as well as underlying operational policies and procedures to ensure that you comply with legal requirements and that there is consistency with the way consumers are treated.
Tricia, on that point, isn't it important that the operational policies and procedures, that what actually happens in practice within the organization follows what's in the policies and procedures? I know that many times organizations have done things a particular way and they have evolved over time, and perhaps the policies and procedures haven't kept up with that. Would it be a good idea for companies to compare their actual practices to their policies and procedures and make adjustments where necessary?
Absolutely. The policies themselves should be sort of the overarching principles that guide both the organization from a compliance management perspective, as well as the individual operational policies, for example, your collections department or your credit department. The procedures that flow then from those policies are more detailed accounts that should be the basis for training to explain how to implement those policies and supplement those policies on a day-to-day basis. And what happens oftentimes is that companies will compile policies and procedures, but they're not subject to a periodic review, so that they become outdated or they haven't kept up with the pace of legal requirements. And so there's definitely an inconsistency between what is happening on the floor, as it were, versus what the policies and procedures say. And that's something that the CFPB is absolutely going to look to make certain that you are periodically reconciling these to what actually goes on, as well as integrating new laws and new regulations and even sort of new concepts. For example, in UDAP, where Dodd-Frank added the abusive piece to what we'll call the standard definition of what was unfair or deceptive, that has made its way into policies and procedures as well.
Can I interject? Could you back up just a second on I think I know, but maybe for the benefit of others, the distinction between UDAP and what came before?
UDAP, what you've seen historically was an unfair and deceptive acts and practices. There was an extra A, as we like to call it, added to the definition, which is abusive. And abusive is very broad, and it gives the regulators a wider purview in what they are looking at under that statute.
Okay, thanks.
So the UDAP standard is the unfair and the deceptive standard has been around for a very long time, and certainly non-depository finance companies are accustomed to issues related to unfair and deceptive acts and practices through their historical regulation by the Federal Trade Commission. And the standards that the Federal Trade Commission uses for unfair and deceptive are similar, or if not identical, to what we have historically seen the FTC use. So that's helpful. But to Tricia's point, abusive is a new animal, and the Bureau has only recently begun to use its abusive authority in some consent orders. If you take a moment and go to the CFPB website and read some of the more recent consent orders, there will be allegations of abusive activities that might give you a sense of how they think of abusive. But Tricia is absolutely right in that the standard that was written into Dodd-Frank is very broad, does not give a lot of guidance as to, for example, how abusive is different from unfair or deceptive, and whether it's a unique standard and a unique violation, or whether it's just another way to pile on, if you will, to the unfair and abusive standard. Jennifer, you are with a non-depository finance company, and without telling us what your particular company is doing, as someone on the inside, can you tell us a little bit about how you would think about preparing for the Bureau to show up at your doorstep?
All right. Well, from my perspective, being the regulatory exam specialist, my responsibilities and roles in regarding any examination, whether it's a state exam or a federal exam, is to be the gatekeeper of all the information and data that flows to and from the regulation body and our company. I also am the communicator and the sole person that would be speaking to the regulators on a daily basis. That's not to say that there wouldn't be other management and or other personnel that would be interviewed, so forth, during the exam. But I am the main contact for the examination daily, and I'm also the records keeper. And technically, I guess I manage the examination itself. So from my perspective in getting ready for an exam is what I would hope that most entities would take this future examination process seriously. It starts from management on the way down. And I would suggest anyone to possibly do a mock exam to understand your weaknesses and then prioritize those weaknesses and start with the larger of those weaknesses first and try to correct them or work on them prior to an examination. And then getting down to my level of an actual examination of what I would want to see, I would want to make sure that we are staffed properly, and going forward, making sure that vacations are structured so that the department is not left in a lurch and that someone is always here and ready to go. Preparation is key. Having your security protocols in place, and what I mean by that is that whatever your protocols are for anyone who shows up on site to your facility, that you keep those same protocols, and you will be communicating those to the CFPB. If that means that they must wear their identification at all times and that they're only allowed to be in a conference room, or that they cannot wander the building, these things need to be communicated to them, and you need to make sure that they understand that. But preparing for the exam, these are things that you need to keep in mind. And also, how would you log documentation that goes to and from your organization to the CFPB? They're allowed to have requests for documentation, so you need to be able to manage that huge load of document requests, interviews of personnel, possibly having presentations by upper management. These things have to be organized. You have to make sure. So that's a huge key component of just planning for the CFPB to come on site. Second thing is that I would also suggest is that you practice with your state examinations. As an auto finance company, we are constantly under state examinations because we do business in all 50 states, which means we're open to examination in all 50 states. So when you have your state examiners come in a mail-in audit, which means that you're actually sending documentation off-site, my suggestion with you is that you practice with the examiners. Anything that you see in your process today with those examiners that need tweaked or tightened up, or you take care of that today. And state examinations are a great prep process for the federal examination. Of course, the federal examination is going to be 10 times worse, but at least you have to start somewhere. You have to have a basis, and if you're not, if your state examination process isn't nailed down, then you know you're going to probably encounter some problems with a federal exam.
Tricia, maybe you can tell us a little bit about having been through many federal type exams in your past. What is a federal exam like, just generally? And you've probably been through the state exams as well, I would imagine. Can you talk a little bit about how they're different?
Sure. From my experience, the state exams tended to be more technical compliance oriented. Remember too, the state examiners don't have at their disposal the quantity of resources that the federal examiners do. They're on a more limited time frame, they're on a more limited budget, so they tend to do more targeted exams. The federal examiners, particularly the OCC, also tended to have they had a broader perspective from the exams, but the CFPB honestly comes in with an even wider purview than the OCC. So the CFPB is really the most intense exam I think you can undergo from a consumer regulator. Because the breadth of the exam is so great, so they are looking at a number of statutes, consumer statutes, ECOA, fair debt collections, et cetera, the sorts of things that you'll see in the exam manual. But under that UDAP review, they can actually get to state issues as well, which is, I think, a point that not a lot of examinees understand at this point. So you may end up not only with federal issues, but they can actually target state issues as well under the UDAP purview.
And that actually brings up a good point, because very often when an organization goes through a state exam, many times they come out very clean, other times they come out with reports indicating that certain things need to be adjusted or changed. Those are the things that the Bureau would be looking at, what are those exam reports? What do they say? What action did you take on them? And the same is true probably of your internal audit reports. They'll want to see those things, the audit reports. They'll look to see what sorts of deficiencies may have been noted in the audit report, and then they'll probably look to see how was it addressed. So one of the things maybe that's important to make sure that you have process for doing is to address those issues that show up in audit reports and in state exams, so that when a federal examiner comes in and looks at those things, they can look and say, oh, I see this needed to be fixed, and you fixed it. Is that a fair statement, Tricia?
No, that is absolutely true. And the types of documents that you're describing are things that they will absolutely request of you. I think one of the key differences between a CFPB exam and any other federal or state exam that a company may undergo is the volume of document production, especially early on. When you get a first day letter and you begin literally.
Well, let me interrupt here, Tricia, because you're actually going directly where I wanted to go, which is, how does all this start? I mean, we're subject to examination maybe come September 1st. How are we going to know that we're going to be examined? How does the process start?
Well, you'll get the first day letter with many document requests. And as I said, it's pages of requirements on an incredibly broad array of topics, including how you handle your compliance process, how you audit, how you do consumer complaints. They will ask an enormous amount of questions about your compliance with ECOA and Reg B, collection statutes, variety of servicing statutes, including how you process transactions. So the document request will really cover departments within your entire organization.
And is the first day letter the first notice you have that an examination has been scheduled?
It's difficult for me to gauge what they will do. Remember, when dealing with the larger banks, which was their initial, their initial covered folks that they were covering from a supervisory perspective, because they work closely with the OCC, there were relationships with those companies, and so there may have been phone conversations or what have you. So it's unclear to me as they move into the larger participant rule, where there really hasn't been federal involvement, whether or not the first day letter will be the first point of contact, or there will be sort of that warning phone conversation.
Which is always nice to get a heads up.
Yes,
right?
it is definitely always nice to get that warning shot fired.
So we get this first day letter, which is the official notice, I guess, that an examination has commenced. And it asks for, scads and scads of documents. How long might a company have to get those documents together and produce them for the examiners?
I would say, and again, having dealt with the larger financial institutions who were more prepared for these kinds of document requests, in part because of undergoing OCC or those types of exams before. The time frame was, in my opinion, something considerably less than generous. It could be anywhere from 2 weeks to 30 or 45 days. With larger participants now, one can only hope that they understand that this type of document production is very new to these sorts of companies, and that turning something around in a 2-week time period is going to be a very ambitious process. The other thing that should be noted is that when they do the document request, there's what I like to think of as 2 pieces to the puzzle. Here are the canned documents that we have that you've requested: policies, procedures, reports, minutes, etc. Then there is a data dump that they want so that they can do a review for ECOA, dealer markup, etc. type reviews where they will themselves massage the data. They will likely need that data dump earlier because it's going to take them more effort to get to the point where they are able to do a review.
And I think one good thing about, not that there's anything good about having to do the data dump, but if we compare that process in the examination context to the data dump process in an investigation and an enforcement context, I think you end up with a little bit more leeway in terms of how the information is compiled and delivered. On the investigation side, on the enforcement side of the CFPB, they have very, very specific document submission standards, and particularly for electronic documentation and data that have to be observed. I may be wrong here, but my senses and my thought about this from talking to folks who've been through exams is that perhaps the submission requirements are not quite as onerous in the exam context as they are in an enforcement context.
Michael, from my understanding as well, there is a little bit more flexibility on the supervisory side versus the enforcement side. That is my understanding as well. But just so that everyone understands, as you produce these materials, you have to make sure that however you are submitting them, that it's secure, because this is an enormous amount of corporate confidential information as well as non-public personal information, you know, in these data sets and in these documents.
Sure. So we've got the first day letter, we've produced our documents and our data, and now they're going to show up at the door. And Jennifer, I would imagine that you alluded to this earlier, that you would sort of handle the on-site visit pretty much in the same way that you would handle a state examiner on-site visit. Just logistically, can you sort of walk us through things that you think about when you're managing an exam and managing the examiners on-site?
Of course. Some of the things that we think about initially in any exam is that we want to make sure of logistics. Where do we put the examiners, and how do we deal with them on a day-to-day basis that is, one, protective of the rest of the business, is true to our security protocols, which our company demands of us, and also accomplishes what exactly the CFPB wants to do itself. And of course, there's always basics in a state exam. You need to have a desk space and a telephone, possibly a computer connection. In that context, I also then look beyond that, and within our own organization, if they were to be here where I'm located, that I also want to make sure that they're near the front of the building, they are near my desk since I am managing the exam, that there's a bathroom in a close location, and that, again, stressing the fact that they are towards the front of the building so that, one, we don't allow anyone in our business, and I don't know how it is for other folks, but because we do have a lot of consumer non-public data, we don't allow anyone who's a non-employee to be wandering our buildings. So from the very first day, when the examiners get on site, we do go through the security protocols, and one of them is that they must at all times have their federal identification on them at all times, that if they are to go anywhere outside of the washroom, which is right by their conference room, that they are to come see me and I can take them if necessary somewhere. All interviews for other personnel, if they need to speak to somebody, will be done through me. So there's really no reason for them to wander the building or go outside of their area that we've kind of instructed is where they're going to be working out of. I would also suggest that working hours are set. What are the common working hours for the examination? This is something you probably have to negotiate with your examiners. Usually the state examiners are pretty flexible. I always schedule them about a half an hour to quit their examination for the day, a half an hour before I technically have to leave for the day. This allows follow-up and work that I need to do in regards to them being here. But beyond that, going back to the part of the logistics, is your factor in this, and that things that you have to remember is control. You don't have a lot of control, but in exams per se, regarding documents and data requests, because you must give what you are asked. But there are certain things regarding the movement within your own building which you do control. And I would suggest at the very beginning and onset to make sure that those things are quite clear. I don't think you have to be negative about it. I think that they will understand and appreciate your security protocols. Be organized in regards to them coming on site. I would suggest also that you have 2 meetings per day in the very least. That is always the first meeting of the day, where you start the day off with their their requirements, also cover things that may have been left over from the day. If you owe any documentation or any interviews or anything, to go through that in the morning. And that would be similar to the end of the day where you would have a closed meeting to, again, restate what is owed to them if they've requested things that you have not yet been able to give them in the short period of time that they were there for that day. And then the process again starts over the next day. I would also suggest always having an open and a closed meeting. If you know the day that they're arriving, you would have organize this with the CFPB, and of course they're also going to give you their requests of how they may want to start the exam, so you would keep that in mind as well. But then of course there should always be a closed meeting with all the pertinent employees and management, and that's kind of it when you get started. Now, as far as that goes when they actually get here, we're going to have to learn that just like everybody else will.
Yeah, I just want to mention.
So Tricia, what Jennifer's describing is really the need for a gatekeeper. And I interrupted you, and I apologize. So if you would say what you're going to say, and then maybe talk to us about really how important that gatekeeper role is, and the sorts of things that individual will do, that would be helpful.
Michael, you read my mind. That's precisely where I was headed. The role of, Jennifer, I know you're going to love hearing this, but I see compliance as playing the most critical role in the examination process. I think compliance is best suited to be that gatekeeper, and the way Jennifer's role is structured makes an enormous amount of practical sense to me. A compliance officer should be interfacing with whoever the lead is from the CFPB, and should be providing information back and forth, and should be the point of contact for any requests or any conversations that are required. To set up a meeting, it should go through that compliance officer or someone from the compliance department. And the other role, in addition to acting as the liaison with the agency itself, with the CFPB, the other critical function I think that compliance plays is internally as a project lead type role. And the compliance manager should be tapping people on the shoulder from each of the relevant departments, because you're going to, as you do these data productions, as you have these meetings with the CFPB where there are follow-up items, you're going to need a point person from each relevant area to help you gather the information or to do the presentation that the CFPB is requesting. It's not simply the role of compliance to take over the entire exam and with no intervention or assistance from the remainder of the company. That's certainly not what the CFPB expects, and it should not be what the compliance officer is asked to do either. So that compliance, go ahead.
And what I was going to say is, so how do you pick the people, the folks from the business side to interface with the CFPB, or do you let the CFPB say, I want to talk to this person or this role? How does that work?
The CFPB is going to ask you for a high-level org chart. The folks that consist of what we can call in anyone's organization an executive management team. They will likely expect to at some point meet those people, and often in an initial meeting, that's where it's appropriate for those folks to be, and they can introduce their respective roles within the organization. But with respect to, those folks are way too busy on a day-to-day basis to help locate documents, arrange to have an examiner sit with someone to see how a system works. So there needs to be somebody who is, and you have to pick the right level in your organization, somebody that is high enough to understand how the entire department works, and so that when they are tapped on the shoulder to provide information, they know where to find that within their own department. But it also has to be at a level where they can be responsive, and folks in the department understand that during the period of the examination, they may not be as productive as they normally are because of responding to these needs. So when you're asked to do things for the CFPB, provide information, or more importantly, present something to the CFPB, the CFPB will not pick the person. They will ask you, we need more information about a particular topic. And you will have the ability, and you should use it wisely, to select the person that is most capable of presenting. And to be candid with you, very often the smartest person in the room for a particular department may be the absolute worst speaker. So you have to sort of you have to balance knowledge with ability to speak. And I like to think of it, having done a defensive litigation role, I look at it as if I were asked to send someone to a deposition from a department, who would I select? And I'm going to be candid with you, it's not always the person who runs the entire department. Where you won't have a choice is, for example, if they are doing a matched pair analysis and they...
Can you tell us what that is?
Certainly. So they are looking at two deals in a credit under an ACOA and Reg B review to see if you have complied with the credit requirements under the statute. And they see potentially inconsistent treatment of a protected class as they look at two people who, except for that protected class categorization, look exactly the same from a credit perspective, but they receive different terms. So they want an explanation as to why that occurred. What they may do is they may ask for the credit analyst, to the extent that that credit analyst is still with your organization, they may ask to speak with that person directly. In that instance, if that person is still with your company, you may not have the flexibility. And that's someone where, because they will be lower level in the organization, they will be terrified to speak to the CFPB, and there will need to be some hand-holding, and their supervisor perhaps too may need to join them in the room to support them and to follow up and expand on explanations to the extent that the person isn't capable of doing that in a meaningful way.
And how important is it to have either a lawyer or compliance person in the room at all times? And should they be taking notes or logging requests or things like that? How does that work?
I would think that, and Jennifer can expand on this, but in my opinion, the compliance officer that plays this lead role should be in the room for each and every one of these types of sessions. They should be taking notes because, quite frankly, it is part of their responsibility then to report back to executive management and the larger exam internal team as to where they're headed, what their thoughts are, if they see the focus of the examiner shifting. One thing to note, because depending on the length of the exam, you could have different people come in and out of your exam from the CFPB perspective, which could shift the focus of your exam and require more document production or more focus on a different department. So I think it's critical that that compliance officer sit in the room for all of these presentations. Not every company of the size that they are going to begin to look at has a legal department. So having a lawyer in the room may not be an option, but to the extent that you have one, you may want to consider having them in the room as well, so that, not to play an adversarial role, but so that the attorney can understand what the questions that are asked, what's the legal consideration behind them, and whether there are any gaps that need to get closed.
And whether or not the business person is being asked to make a legal conclusion, correct?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Because you want to avoid that.
I wanted to, could I interject a question too? It may be too soon to know. I don't know if there's been enough experience with the CFPB, but I would have assumed that the vast majority of an examination would be based on the paperwork and the data, and not so much interviewing individuals. Is it a bad sign if suddenly they're calling for lots of individuals, or is it always a mix of both?
Well, I think, Jim, what happens is if you're asked to have people come in and have conversations, what it often means is there's something in, well, two things. Either they simply don't have enough information from the data you provided them to form a conclusion, and so they need to talk to people to understand it better. So that's one thing. It's sort of like inconclusive documentation. Or they are concerned about something in your documentation, and they want to see if it, and we go back to what Michael alluded to earlier, whether that's just something in the documentation that's wrong and that's not reflective of practice, or your practice may be wrong too.
Tricia, would you also agree, this is Jennifer, that in some cases too that the CFPB may not be fully understanding the way that auto finance actually works, and not so much the documentation may not be complete, but there are times when they're not going to fully understand how our systems compare to somebody else's systems, and how do we do this versus how someone else does something, and it may not be blatantly obvious by paperwork. So they may at times need to interview folks for those purposes. And to another agreement, something you said earlier, Tricia, was that no employee is ever by themselves alone with any examiner of any level, federal or state. And yes, I would be in the room with them at all times. And you made very good points about taking notes, because that is exactly what happens. It's for the support of the employee, but also for the support of the entity itself.
I agree. And the point that you're raising, Jennifer, I agree with you. I think the CFPB has had a lot of turnover, well, and at least in the earlier part of post-inception. As a result of that, and a result of them where they're hiring people who are not necessarily, for example, in the auto space, but they are reviewing the auto industry, that there is a huge learning curve. Lots of conversation, and a number of us in the room, will know what that means, two-party versus three-party paper. That's an explanation for them, because that's not intuitive. You actually have to understand how the auto industry works with a number of the terminology that gets used in some of the documentation, and it has to be explained.
Correct. It's also from my experience. I'm sorry, I was going to say, it's also from my experience as well, is that we sometimes see a lot of examiners from the mortgage industry, and their terminology and the things that they require and they see on that end are not always the things that we see on our end.
Absolutely. And the other thing that will cause, Jim, conversations with business people in the organization is when they see something and they are trying to get a deeper understanding of, for example, a business justification for a policy that you have, that on its face concerns them, but they're willing to listen to see whether there's a valid reason for you doing something in a particular way that is not completely reflective in your documentation. And so they will ask you to do a presentation about that particular topic.
Okay. We're getting somewhat short on time. I wanted to ask too, before we part, is there any predicting which non-banks are going to be at the head of the line once larger participant takes effect? Is there a pool in the industry on that, or is there just no predicting?
I'll take the first crack at that, Jim. to a large extent, there's no predicting in terms of, or based on anything that they have said or anything that's been published in the rule. But my gut feeling is that the folks at the top of the list are not going to necessarily be the folks that you might expect, the large captive finance companies. I think they might undertake one or two of those, but I think their focus is going to start with the subprime auto finance companies. And the reason that I say that is because if you look at the consent orders that are out there today, where they have focused on auto finance, they have focused on subprime auto finance. So I would assume that the priorities on the enforcement side, probably not good to make an assumption here, but I would assume that the priorities on the enforcement side are probably going to also reflect the priorities on the supervision side of the house, and maybe that's where they start. I'd be interested in what other people think.
I think that's definitely possible because obviously subprime is just such a concern overall. However, I think one of the things that they really didn't get the opportunity to do up until the clarification that we recently saw issued is sink their teeth into leasing. And I do think that they would like that opportunity to take a look at a company that engages in leasing, because it opens up an entirely new world, quite frankly, with things like lease end, which they haven't really been able to kick the tires on until now.
Right. And I think I'm going to have to interrupt here. We're running low on time. I would just like to thank the speakers for participating today, and that's all we're going to have time for. The Center for Auto Finance Excellence is committed to bringing you quality content on best practices in auto lending and leasing. We hope you will join the center at www.autofinanceexcellence.org to receive our alerts and to participate in other center events. Please be sure to keep an eye open for additional events from the Center for Auto Finance Excellence. Thanks once again to our partner Fiserv for their support, and thanks again also to the speakers. This concludes today's conference. Have a wonderful day.